I am back. And in Cuba, in the late '80s, they had something called the rectification movement, which was a reinforcing of their Marxist Leninist principles and such. So it's important to note all of this. It's very important to note all of this. Now, in Cuba, they have a network well embedded in the population to support the revolution. In every neighborhood, they have something called Committees to Defend the Revolution, or CDRs, they are called. Um, and these committees to defend the revolution, these CDRs, they are very, very heavily involved with the population, with the public, and you know, they get stuff done. They know everybody in the neighborhood. They know who's loyal to the party and who's not. They know what the community is feeling. And it's kind of this network that the Cuban Communist Party has created that kind of brings people into the political process, monitors the situation on a very local community level. It's very, very effective. It's a very, very effective model that the Cubans have, right? And the Bolivarian circles are very much inspired by it. And what the Cubans have done is inspired by the Soviets and the Soviet Union. It's inspired by what the Chinese Communist Party has done. But these CDRs, Committees to Defend the Revolution, that they have throughout the country, are very, very effective, very, very effective in kind of monitoring and dealing with situations like this. And you have to be sure that since the '80s, Cuba has been preparing for a situation like this. When I went to the World Festival of Youth and Students in 2013, they actually had a speaker. And that speaker was from I mean, he was somebody who had, I guess he was a Cuban government person who had infiltrated an attempted color revolution in Cuba. And he had seen it from the inside. And he described it. He gave a presentation describing what this attempted color revolution that he had infiltrated in Cuba was like. And he described it. And apparently he's published a book that's available in Spanish. I don't think it's available in English. But he published a book available in Spanish describing the process of how these color revolutions are carried out. So we're seeing destabilization of Cuba. We're seeing the Cuban right wing in the United States mobilizing to support them. We're seeing the Cuban public pouring into the streets to oppose the counter-revolution, to oppose the pro-Western forces that want the Cuban president to step down and are mobilizing against the Communist Party. And we shall see how this plays out. The timing, as I said before, is a little bit suspicious. So I'm eyeing the situation with caution. And I think we should all eye it with caution. And now is the time, folks. Now is absolutely the time to tell our friends, tell our coworkers, tell our classmates, tell the people in our neighborhood, tell the people that we know, tell the people we work with the truth about the Cuban Revolution. We absolutely must, we absolutely must not hold back from telling our friends and coworkers and associates the truth about the Cuban Revolution. Protests. Classist. The truth about the Cuban Revolution. And a great source for information that documents very, very well the achievements of the Cuban Revolution is called the CIA World Factbook. I kid you not, the CIA World Factbook. And it's online. The CIA World Factbook is a compilation of information published by the US CIA on every country in the world. And it contains life expectancy. And it contains infant mortality rate. And it contains the rate of literacy. And it contains access to improved drinking water. And it has all those kind of statistics, right? You go to a section that, they have a profile of every country, and you go to the section marked people. It'll tell you the average age in the country. It'll tell you the average life expectancy in the country. It'll tell you the infant mortality rate, access to improved drinking water, unemployment, all kinds of things. And if you pull up the CIA World Factbook and compare the Cuba page to any country in that region, Cuba is doing better. Compare Cuba to Mexico. Compare Cuba to Honduras. Compare Cuba to Guatemala. Compare Cuba to Jamaica. Compare Cuba to Haiti. Compare Cuba to the Dominican Republic. Compare Cuba to any other country in that region. And it is very clear that in terms of basic societal health, infant mortality rates, very important indicator of societal health, life expectancy, literacy, access to improved drinking water. In terms of such things, Cuba is doing a very, very, very good job. It's doing a very good job. A very good job. Compared to any other country in that region, to all the countries in that region where Wall Street and capitalism run rampant, in those countries, there tends to be lower infant mortality rates, lower life expectancy, or higher infant mortality rates, lower life expectancy, higher rates of illiteracy. You go down the line. Cuba's basic societal health is far better than its neighbors throughout the region. And you have to keep in mind, none of those neighbors are facing an economic blockade. If you want to send some medicine to El Salvador, you can do it. If you want to send some medicine to Honduras, you can do it. But if you want to send some medicine to Cuba, you're going to have a problem with the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC. They're not going to let you do that, right? And in fact, if you're a German company and you want to sell some medicine to the United States, in order to import it, you're going to have to fill out a form certifying you are not selling medicine to Cuba. It is a horrendous, restrictive blockade that Cuba is subject to. It prevents people from getting medicine they need, prevents Cuba from getting machines and supplies it needs. It's a crippling blockade that is responsible for the death. I don't even know what that means, Red Illuminati. I don't know what that means. It's responsible for the death of lots of people. Thousands of people have died as a result of the U.S. blockade of Cuba. But even still, in terms of basic societal health, Cuba is better off than all the capitalist countries in that region, by far. I brought this up in my debate with the game streamer Destiny Stephen Bonnell, and he was at a loss for words. And he said, "What does life expectancy prove?" And that was. Destiny didn't know what hit him. If you want to talk about Cuba's achievements, you can quote the Guardian newspaper in the UK, not an anti-imperialist publication, but the Guardian. They might be liberal. They have praised Cuba very, very much. Another good source is Ban Ki-moon, who was the UN Secretary General, definitely not an anti-imperialist. Ban Ki-moon said that Cuba has the greatest medical school in the world. Praise for Cuba is very widespread across Europe. It's widespread across Africa and South America. And Cuba's achievements are massive. Massive. Cuban literacy volunteers go all over the world. Cuban doctors go all over the world. Cuba's achievements are massive. And the people in Cuba live much better as a result of those things. All right, you're talking about solidarity movement. All right, Cuba and solidarity in Poland, and that's the situation. And again, this is the kind of thing that you wouldn't really know about. But U.S. media has worked very, very hard to cover it up. They say, oh, they're all poor there because of socialism. No, actually, despite a huge economic blockade, despite numerous attempts by the U.S. government to try and overthrow the Cuban government, the people of Cuba are living better than other peoples throughout the region. That's a fact, and the CIA World Factbook backs that up. I mean, do we think the CIA that has tried to overthrow, Fidel Castro how many times? Do you think they're lying in order to make Cuba look good? Of course not. Of course not. Another good source of information about Cuba is the country study, right? The U.S. Library of Congress. Again, not a communist institution. The U.S. Library of Congress has published a country study of every country in the world. And the country studies of the U.S. Library of Congress are very, very useful when it comes to providing information. The U.S. Library of Congress country studies, they will give you in-depth information about pretty much every country in the world. And if you look at the U.S. Library of Congress country studies, they will talk about Cuba's achievements in terms of healthcare, its achievements in terms of education, the number of doctors that they have trained, the number of universities that they've constructed. It just has basic data about how socialism has improved the lives of people in Cuba. And it's just basic data. I mean, I'm not talking, you can talk to people who've actually been there with the Venceremos brigades or with Pastors for Peace. You can talk to those folks, and they can give you much more in-depth analysis of how the Cuban Revolution has improved people's lives. But let me add that it must be said, it absolutely must be said, it absolutely must be said that the U.S. Library of Congress, the CIA World Factbook can attest to Cuba's achievements. The massive achievements of the Cuban Revolution are very, very real, and they're very, very measurable, and that Cubans live far better than most peoples throughout that region, and that is due to socialism. It's due to socialism. So that point must be made. You can talk about the solidarity that Cuba has had, the fact that Asada Shakur, a black liberation fighter, remains in Cuba, that she's in Cuba. The U.S. government, framed her up and was going to, put her in prison, and she broke out of prison, and now she's in Cuba. She's got refuge. Cuba was very supportive of the Black Panther Party of the United States. In fact, when there was a black activist in North Carolina, in Monroe, North Carolina, and Robert F. Williams was his name, and he was charged with a crime for getting into a shootout with the Ku Klux Klan. Robert F. Williams fled from the United States, and he went to Cuba. And from Cuba, Robert F. Williams, he broadcast a radio program called Radio Free Dixie. You can Google Radio Free Dixie. And it was a whole radio program in the early 1960s dedicated to promoting the black liberation struggle in the United States. They actually had a radio broadcast from Cuba into the United States of America, supporting black freedom struggle and black revolution. You can talk about the fact that Cuba, has been very, very supportive of the Palestinian people and their struggle against oppression by Israel. Cuba has been very, very supportive. They were extremely supportive of the people of South Africa. Nelson Mandela has said glowing things about Fidel Castro. Nelson Mandela and Fidel Castro were good friends, good buddies, and Cuba was a big supporter of the struggle against apartheid. Cuba sent soldiers to Angola to fight against the apartheid government. When the apartheid regime of South Africa attacked Angola, the socialist government of Angola, the Cubans sent their military to Angola to fight against the apartheid regime. There are many examples of Cuba's solidarity with people around the world, and they send material aid and assistance not just to socialist countries, but to many developing poor capitalist countries. Many African countries have Cuban doctors, Cuban volunteers in them. Cuba's achievements are massive. Now someone says Cuba protests seem so staged. All the neocon and pro-U.S. hegemony politicians seem to have tweeted and prepared the statement. Exactly. And I said that at the beginning of the stream before I was interrupted. I made this point that absolutely must be made, that this is being planned, right? This is being planned. This is coordinated. And it may be that they don't actually think they can go all the way and overthrow the Cuban government. It may be that the CIA and American intelligence is trying to see what they can get away with. They're trying to see how far they can push it. How much of a mess can they make? Wrote it down. How much of a mess can they make? And I will address that. Your concern there. Doesn't Cuba have the seventh? I don't know about that. But we'll see. We shall see. We shall see. We shall see. And one thing I do want to say, I just have to say this. I guess we'll end the opening remarks by me making this point. Ceausescu. We'll make this point. And I'll end the opening remarks, and then we'll start answering super chats, because it's a late night, and, I don't want to go forever on here, but I can answer your questions. So many people think that they know about Cuba because they talked to a Cuban exile, to a Gusano, or the child of a Gusano, or the cousin of a Gusano. And this is one of the curses of being in the United States, is that there's these people who fled Cuba at the time of the revolution, or more recently, anti-communist Cubans. And they're walking around. They get automatic permission to stay in the country, right? If you're fleeing from Honduras, you're fleeing from Guatemala, forget it. But if you're fleeing from Cuba, automatically, wet foot, dry foot, they let you into the country. And these people, they get here and they learn to say what Americans want to hear. And they walk around saying the most god-awful, over-the-top anti-Cuban statements. A great story I heard. A friend of mine, she attends synagogue services. And there was someone at her synagogue who was Cuban. And this woman at her synagogue was very anti-Castro, right? And so she asked this Cuban woman at her synagogue, what human rights violations are there in Cuba? Can you tell me what human rights Fidel Castro is violating? And the woman replied by saying, all of them. And she said, yes, but can you give me a concrete example of Fidel Castro violating human rights? And she said, he violates all of them. No one in Cuba has any rights. He violates all of them, all of them. And she said, yes, but can you tell me an example of how Fidel Castro violated your rights? And she said, I told you. And she's starting getting angry. All of them. I told you he violated all of the human rights. He doesn't respect a single right of the people. That's pretty much the Cuban exile community. That's the Cuban exile community. There's a joke that people tell. That there's two dogs. It's a cartoon, right? And there's two dogs going down the street. And the one dog says to the other dog, I was a Great Dane back in Cuba. I was a Great Dane back in Cuba. Meaning that, these Cuban exiles often exaggerate how great they were before Fidel Castro ruined everything, right? Every Cuban exile wants you to believe he was a millionaire, he was a billionaire, he was a wealthy person, and then Fidel ruined it all. A lot of them weren't, but he wants you to think that he was this really important person and the evil communists ruined it, and that's a joke you hear. But these Miami Cubans, they will say what Americans want to hear, right? They will say what Americans want to hear. And they will sit there and they'll say, everyone in Cuba is starving. Oh no, I've been there, I've seen it. Every person in Cuba is starving. Every person in Cuba is starving. And it's all because of communism. Communism doesn't work. I've been to Cuba. I've seen it. Look how, and they always compare Cuba to the United States, a country that is a Western capitalist country that has centuries of colonialism and super profits at the expense of the third world. And they always say, oh, look how many more material goods we have in the United States. They don't bother to compare Cuba to Jamaica or the Dominican Republic or Haiti or the surrounding countries. They always compare Cuba to the United States. There was a website for a while. I think it's been taken down. It might still be up. And it was called, and yes, you're right about that, Paul. You're right about that. But there was actually a website called The Real Cuba. And it was this, it was like, it says, when you go to Cuba, you just get a propaganda tour. But here, if you look at this website, you'll see the real Cuba. And, this website, one of the things on the website, I'll never forget this. It had a picture of a refrigerator. A refrigerator. It was, kind of rusty, kind of old. And it said, this is the refrigerator that every Cuban family has. And then next to it, they had a picture of like a fancy new American refrigerator. Well, here's the thing, folks. Anyone who's ever been to the developing world knows how idiotic that meme is. You know why? Because do you know how many people in Mexico have no refrigerator? Are living in shacks without running water and electricity? Do you know how many people in the mountains of Ecuador or in the mountains of, in the mountains of Bolivia or in the mountains of, developing countries don't have any refrigerator? I mean, do you know how many people in Haiti would kill to have a refrigerator that worked? I mean, this is so ridiculous. So ridiculous. Oh, look, every Cuban family has a refrigerator. Every single one has a refrigerator. But the refrigerator they have is not as good as this fancy American refrigerator. So that means Cuba's achieved nothing. That's the logic of the Miami Cubans. That's how they argue. It's nonsensical, right? If you know anything about the developing world, the fact that every family in Cuba has a refrigerator, that is a huge achievement. The fact that they've wiped out illiteracy, the fact there's universal employment, the fact that in Cuba, after you've lived in your house for long enough, it's yours. And the fact that your rent in Cuba can never be more than 10% of your income. Did you know that? Your rent in Cuba can never be more than 10% of your income. Do you know how many New York City residents would kill to have their rent be 10% of their income? I know a lot of people whose rent is 50% of their income. I know a lot of people in New York whose rent is more than 50% of their income. But in Cuba, your rent cannot be more than 10% of your income. So the achievements for the population, are massive, but we never hear about that. And these right wing folks walk around and my cousin, my brother, it's just they have horror stories that are unconfirmed. There's a bunch of these silly memes in the U.S. It seems like your income can never be more than 10%. There you go. But there are these horror stories that are unconfirmed, right? There's a couple cliche ones, right? Now, one of them, that the right-wing Cubans will tell is they'll say, when I was in Cuba, one day the teacher came to school and he said to us that we should all pray to Jesus that we should get candy. And so we all prayed, and no candy was there. And then the teacher told us to pray to Fidel Castro and the Communist Party. And so we prayed to the Communist Party. And then the teacher pulled out candy and told us there is no God, but there's candy, and gave us all candy to make us believe in communism. That's how evil communism is. Oh, Jesus. Well, here's the thing. That actually comes from a movie. That actually comes from a right-wing anti-communist movie. That didn't happen. It comes from a stupid right-wing anti-communist movie. But every Cuban exile you've ever met tells you that happened to them. It's from a movie. It didn't happen. And in fact, Fidel Castro has, had confession with the Pope. And in the final years, in the 1990s, Fidel Castro became a Christian. And Catholicism is widely practiced in Cuba, as is Santeria, the African religion. There's a number of Baptists. Part of the reason that gay marriage is not legal in Cuba is because while many leaders of the Communist Party, such as Mariela Castro, who I have met, Mariela Castro, were photographed together, want gay marriage to be legal, there are a lot of Cubans who have converted to being Christian evangelical fundamentalists, and they don't want gay marriage to be legal. So again, you're only hearing one side of the story. Are there progressive elements of the U.S. capitalist class that workers could partner with for building socialism? Should we maintain independence and hegemony over the capitalist class in the United States, the socialist U.S.? All right. Progressive elements in the capitalist class. There you go. So that question will get an answer. So, what these folks say, I mean, I'm sorry, some things are true, some things are not. I really can't stand George Lopez. George Lopez is a very right-wing, awful comedian. Very right-wing, very awful. But there's an episode of his show, and it's actually a really bad right-wing episode of his show. It's where, his daughter is like protesting against George W. Bush, and she's like ditzy and stupid and all this stuff. And so, she's considered to be right-wing, or she's considered to be this left-wing ditzy or whatever. But at one point, so she's going to go protest against George W. Bush and his war. I remember this. It was an episode of George Lopez. And her mom, who is Cuban, is saying, your brothers are in jail in Cuba for speaking up against the government. You should be respectful of America. And I remember at one point, the George Lopez, his character, he says to the Cuban wife, he says, that's not why they're in jail. And that pretty much sums it up for you. And that tells you a lot about what you need to know about the Cuban exile community. He's like, that's not why they're in jail. That's not why they're in jail. And it's true. That is not why they're in jail. I mean, there are the Cuban exile community, they are notorious for making up horror stories that people want to hear. Just making up horror stories that people, and the sad thing is, you meet so many people that think they are an expert on Cuba because they heard these horror stories. To clarify my question, I think it's important to have a market sector, capitalists in the party, or leadership in a workers' state. All right, so writing that down, capitalists in party in workers' state. All right, you will definitely get an answer. So there you go. So as we're watching this, we should be very concerned. I made that stream on Saturday warning about the guns of August. And my prediction came even more true. So now not only do we have the USA on the brink of sending troops to Haiti, now in addition to that, we've got an attempted color revolution in Cuba. So global situations are escalating. Cuba's got Russian friends. It's got Chinese friends. It's got Venezuelan friends. It's got Iranian friends. And if they go to invade Cuba, things could get very, very ugly. I mean, this could escalate to a new world war. This could escalate to a new world war. It's a very, very dangerous situation. So we should all be keeping our eyes on it. And now is the time to bring people facts, economic data about how socialism has worked in Cuba, how despite everything the Cubans are up against, they have had so many victories. This is the time that we need to hit people with real economic data and truth. We just need to hit people with truth. And the thing is there corruption in Cuba? I'm sure there is. I'm sure there's corruption in Cuba. There's been a new wave of crime. I know that since there's been some tourism coming in, there's been some crime that they've had in Cuba. Smartphones have been stolen and stuff. It's one problem. There's kind of been a wave of theft of smartphones. That's not good, right? And obviously when you have shortages, the imperialists are engineering these shortages, trying to hurt and wreck the Cuban economy. When you have shortages, some people have and some people have not. And sometimes when there's a shortage, the way it works, okay, why is why is he getting timed out? When you have shortages, things are going to be handed out in a nepotistic way sometimes, and that's not good. So there are things that could be problematic. There are things there are things that people may have legitimate grievances about, and we shouldn't deny that. We shouldn't pretend that everything is perfect. We shouldn't pretend that everything is perfect. We shouldn't pretend that everything is ideal, right? We shouldn't pretend that. Oh, okay, there's impersonators in the chat. Oh boy. All right, we'll survive. We'll survive. I mean, this is what happens when you make bread tubers angry. We will survive, folks. We've been through worse. But this is what happens, right? And that ultimately, Cuba is fighting for its life, and it's a society that has achieved so much. It has stood in solidarity with people around the world against imperialism. And now we need to stand in solidarity with them and not let the imperialists continue to destabilize Cuba. We need to make that happen. We need to make sure, we need to make sure that they're not able to pull off a color revolution, and that's what needs to happen. So, on that note, folks, I guess we will do our roll call, and then I'll answer these super chat questions, and then we're done. So, names and locations, names and locations. I will call you out as I see you, names and locations. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Who's with us? Who's with us tonight? There you go. North New Jersey, Robert in Hawaii, good friend of the show. Tamara and Dario from Brooklyn. Cleveland, Pirate Alex. Neocons being relentless. My parents' house in southern New Hampshire, says Chaya, good friend of the show. Clyde Bank, Char Darling, good friend of the program, is here. Ryan in Oakland is with us. Tennessee, Fire 667. Temple, California. Santa Barbara, California. LOL, all good, says Parasocialite. Los Angeles. Joey from Belize. Nate in California. Canada, Springfield, Missouri. Sean Hazley in Florida. Tucker Marks. Anthony in Detroit. Sup from China. There you go. Ghani, Texas. East Harlem, New York City. Dylan from California. Very good. Shulgi from California. Nassau County, New York. Char Darling. Bronx, New York. Wisconsin. San Francisco. Adelaide, Australia. New York City. Carolyn and Staten Island, New York. Indonesia. Right? Danny from Illinois. Natalie in Maryland. Vicksburg, Mississippi. Mark from San Diego. Los Angeles. John in Houston. Asheville. There you go. The Real Kinky in Joshua Tree, South Florida. Montana, Billings, Montana, Mike. Don in New York City. Tristan from Maryland. Houston, Texas. Chicago, the Channel Islands. Arturo in Alaska. Vinicius from Brazil. Texas. Communist Party of Canada. Greg, very good. Hannah, Australia. Fairhope, Alabama. Traverse, Michigan. West Virginia. Auckland, New Zealand. Richmond, Virginia. Excuse me. Brad from St. Louis. Queensland, Australia. Balthazar in Oakland. Message retracted. That someone super chatted me, message retracted. So I don't know what Patrick wants me to say, but there you go. No Way in Norway, all right. Mo in Pomona, California. Seattle, Washington. Xi Jinping, there you go. Diet Water Gang, very good. Kenneth from the planet Venus, all right, there you go. Calcutta, India. Costa Rica, Harold Sullivan, good friend of the program. Miami, Florida is with us. Welcome, welcome, welcome. All right. There we go. There we go. Anybody else? Names and locations? Gavin, out in Illinois. Well, shout out to you, Gavin. Cuba. All right. Right? So there you go. There you go. Anybody else? Anyone else? Anybody else want me to shout you out? Call you out as I see you. Name and location. Larry Houdini says, greetings, Boris in Asheville. Boris in Asheville, North Carolina. Right? Kendall in San Diego. Northern Kentucky, Big Haywood. Class Analysis out in California is with us. Very good. Welcome, Class Analysis. There you go. Japan, Honolulu, New York City. Very good. Harold Sullivan likes my interview with Danny Shaw. Go watch the interview with Danny Shaw. It was good. Good stuff. Good stuff. Good stuff. Good stuff. Mobile, Alabama. So there you go. Um, all right, Jeff in Studio City. Very good. Pasadena, California. Very good. All right. So someone asked, what makes a counter revolution? What makes a counter revolution? Well, a counter revolution is not a subtle event. A counter revolution usually involves a massive economic implosion and the dismantling of socialized property. When a country has a counter revolution, such as happened in the former Soviet Union, such as happened in Eastern Europe, there is a big dramatic result. A big dramatic result. It's not something that just kind of happens. I mean, that was one thing. When I was a Maoist, when I was an MLM Maoist years ago, when I was like 19, I was in a group. I wasn't in a group. I was kind of in a group. I was around a group, was a fellow traveler of a group, was, I don't know. I was around this Maoist group that maintained that in 1956 the Soviet Union restored capitalism because that was what Mao said. So that was the Gang of Four line, and I tried my hardest to believe that, to be a good loyal member of this group, but I could not logically understand this. How did the means of production in the Soviet Union, how did they go from the hands of the working class to the hands of the capitalist class in 1956, right? Khrushchev made his infamous secret speech, and I guess it must have been one amazingly powerful speech because he spoke and the means of production lifted up and transferred into the hands of another group. It was the dumbest thing. I could not understand how in the world was there a counter revolution in the Soviet Union in 1956 with Khrushchev. But that is something that the Maoist folks believe. And thank you, IO Hillary, for the super chat. Much appreciated. I tried to believe that, but I couldn't believe it. And I mean, they gave me a lot of books on this, and it was all about how, how the Soviet Communist Party's line had strayed from the true revolutionary line, and about how Soviet Union ballets were about knights and castles, but the Chinese communist ballets were revolutionary, but they could never give me anything subjective, anything that really showed that this counter-revolution had happened in 1956. And that was just, and again, I started to realize that a lot of the Marxist Leninist Maoist stuff, the MLM ideology, is not really materialist. It's kind of this, religious kind of thinking. Basically, their argument was that in order to be a socialist country, you can't just be, having the means of production operating according to a rational central plan. You can't just eliminate the chaos of the market. No, no, no. It has to be moving toward the ultimate ideal of communism. But how do you measure that? How do you measure whether or not a society is moving toward the ultimate ideal of communism? You can't. That's totally subjective. That's in the eye of the beholder. And what they would do is they would point toward things in Cuba or things in the Soviet Union after 1956 that they would say somehow, weren't moving toward communism. And I would have this argument with them, and I would say things. They would say, for example, oh, well, Khrushchev wasn't calling for global revolution against the imperialists. So therefore, it wasn't moving toward communism. It wasn't really so. And I would say, well, that's funny because Stalin aligned with the U.S. imperialists during World War II and oriented the U.S. Communist Party to wave the American flag and tell other supporters to vote for Roosevelt. So, was that not moving toward communism? Oh, okay. And they would say Cuba was not really a socialist country because it sold sugar on the international markets. And real socialist countries don't export products to capitalist countries. They built self-reliant economies. And I would say, well, that's funny because Stalin hired engineers from General Electric and General Motors and American corporations to come over, and he even hired the Koch brothers, Fred Koch, to come over there. And Stalin entered all kinds of business agreements, and he sold oil to Nazi Germany, and he sold oil to fascist Italy. So I'm not seeing how, again, you're saying it was socialist under Stalin, but I'm not seeing that. And that a lot of their arguments were basically, it got down to, they would point to something in a socialist country that they did not like. And they would say, that's proof that this country is not moving toward communism. It's not moving toward the ideal of communism. And so therefore it's not socialism. And I would point out that often these things they pointed to were things that went on in Stalin's Russia, and they were things that went on in Mao's China. And when you pointed that out, if it was in Stalin's Russia, they'd say Stalin made so many mistakes. Well, okay, but if Stalin did it, it's just a mistake. But if another socialist country did it, it's proof they're not really socialist. I mean, it doesn't even make any sense, right? And I mean, I don't know. It was just a very subjective way of viewing things. And that, you know, the thing is, the basis of communism, the higher stage of communism, the world with no state, with no inequality, no division between mental and manual labor, from each according to his own ability, to each according to their needs, a world where labor is life's prime want and not a necessity, meaning people only have to work because they feel like it, not because they have to. That ideal, that higher stage of communism, is based on vast material abundance. Right? And Marx makes this very clear. It's only possible when the springs of cooperative wealth flow abundantly. The only way you can achieve a society with total equality, is with vast abundance, because inequality is rooted in scarcity. And this is one of the biggest problems of Cold War communism, is that starting with Stalin and later with Mao and the Gang of Four and with Che Guevara, you got away from this notion. There became this idea that we can white-knuckle communism, right? That we can achieve communism not on the basis of vast abundance, but on the basis of we're just going to do it. We're going to make everything equal. Well, no, you can't do that. You cannot build an egalitarian society on the basis of scarcity. You cannot do that. Right? And if you try to do that, you're going to have problems. And the Cultural Revolution in China was an attempt to do that. They were trying to move toward the higher stage of communism in a state of extreme scarcity and poverty, and it was a disaster. In Cuba, in the early part of the revolution, Che Guevara tried to do the same thing. He got rid of material incentives. He said people should work hard just because it's good for the country. That didn't work out so well, right? You need to reward people for working harder, right, in a state of scarcity. And, Pol Pot is probably the most blatant example of this. He was a crazed ultra-leftist who said you could have total communism on the basis of an agrarian economy. You don't need industry. But in the Cold War, starting with the USSR in the 1950s, under Stalin, in the last years of Stalin's life, Stalin said things like we're entering the early stages of communism. They were not. Because of that, you got this confusion and this basic point of Marxism, which is that scarcity is the basis of hierarchy. Scarcity is the basis of the state, and scarcity is the basis of inequality. Thank you, Herb Bryant. This basic point of Marxism was lost, right? And it's really important that we understand this. And I make this point as much as I possibly can. I make this point because of the fact that nowadays we have people like Jordan Peterson walking around. And Jordan Peterson walks around and he says, oh boy, people are unequal because lobsters have hierarchy in their DNA. And they, lobsters are not equal. And so why should people be equal? A hierarchy is just natural. Human beings, some are better than others and some are just superior to others. Is it in our DNA as human beings to create hierarchies? Yes, it is. It's also in our DNA to run. Did you know that? Human beings have the natural ability to run. We don't run all day long, right? Thank you, Korobarov. We don't run all day long. We run when we need to or when we feel like it. We have the ability to run, but we don't have to run. Human beings have the ability to create hierarchies when it is necessitated. Right? Hunter-gatherer civilization, you had tribes of people, and there was no classes. But those tribes, you can bet they were very authoritarian. In order to survive, I mean, it's a daily battle for existence, practically. I mean, if somebody wasn't pulling their weight in the tribe, I'm sure they dealt with it. You have the emergence of slavery and then feudalism and capitalism. And these hierarchies change as the base of class society changes, right? As the underlying economic base changes, the hierarchies that humans create also change, right? Under hunter-gatherer civilization, you have tribes, and then with the dawn of agriculture, a higher mode of production, we have slavery and eventually feudalism, and then with industry, first with mercantile capitalism and then industry, we have the capitalist mode of production, and that the nature of social hierarchies changes, and hierarchies tend to be loosened as the level of abundance increases. The more material abundance there is, the less human beings have to go out and battle every day against nature for their survival. The less that happens, the more egalitarian society becomes. Why was it that nobody in the world talked about the rights of man, or human rights, or freedom of speech, or freedom of religion until the 1400s in Europe? Is it because Europeans are just better than everybody else? Is it because of the fact that is it just this idea that human beings were just evil up until that point, and then John Locke came along and wrote the rights of man, and humans stopped being evil? No. No, it's because no society had yet, achieved the level of material abundance that made the level of social equality, that level possible, right? And that the basis of breaking down hierarchies, the basis of breaking down inequality, the basis of breaking down the state and the need for coercion and authoritarianism, the basis of all of that is abundance, okay? And then people say, well, Caleb, then why are you a socialist, right? The point of socialism is to do that. And if you're a socialist, then you're saying that we don't need socialism. We just need a bunch of stuff. Well, the problem with capitalism is that under capitalism, abundance creates poverty. The more stuff you have, the poorer everybody gets, right? There's the coal miner's riddle. I've told it many times, the coal miner's riddle. Little boy is cold. He says, "Father, why is it so cold?" The father says, "Because we can't afford any coal." He says, "Why can't we, afford some coal to, put some coal in the stove and light it up?" He says, "Because I lost my job at the coal mine." Little boy says, "Father, why did you lose your job at the coal mine?" He says, "Because there's too much coal." That's capitalism. People are homeless because there are too many houses. People are hungry because there is too much food. People are cold in the winter because there is too much heating gas. This is the capitalist system. This is the capitalist system. It is an irrational mode of production where people only work so long as their labor enriches capital. And the more efficient production becomes, the harder people work, the more efficient production becomes, the poorer people get. That's capitalism. That is capitalism. That's the capitalist system. And socialism eliminates that. It gets rid of this contradiction. So technology no longer creates poverty. Technology no longer holds back human creativity. And the more stuff that's created, the wealthier everyone gets. And the more efficient production becomes, the more technology you advance, the more prosperous society gets. That is the need for socialism. Socialism lays the basis for unlimited economic growth. And China is a great example of that. China has been growing and growing and growing and growing ever since they adopted socialism. It has been an upward trajectory. The Soviet Union was able to keep growing and growing and growing throughout their history. They had other problems, but they were constantly growing. There was constant economic expansion. They didn't have a boom-bust cycle. Under capitalism, you have economic growth for a few years, and it's natural that after a while, you then have an economic crisis. And it's like every few years, you have to have an economic meltdown, right? That is capitalism. That's capitalism, right? Capitalism cannot have unlimited growth. And the more efficient production becomes, the more stuff that's created, the poorer people get. And so by eliminating that, growth is no longer restricted. With a rationally planned economy, where the means of production are organized to serve public good and not profits, You can have unrestricted economic growth, and you can overcome scarcity, and you can get to the ultimate stage of communism. This is what Karl Marx wrote about. This is what Frederick Engels wrote about in Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. This is the scientific understanding of socialism. It took me a long time to answer this question, but it needs to be answered. All right. Rumsfeld passing. Donald Rumsfeld. I did an interview. You can go back and listen to my interview on Sputnik Radio about Rumsfeld. But, Rumsfeld is an interesting character. Rumsfeld, from what I understand, there was somebody in my family who actually like lived near him or something when he was a child. Like I think he used to babysit somebody that I'm related to or something. There's some kind of family connection I have to him, which is a little bit bizarre, right? I'm not related to him, but there's somebody in my family who went to school with him or lived down the street from him or something. I'm trying to remember who it is, and I probably shouldn't say on here. That'd be like doxing myself and that person. But regardless, yeah, I have some kind of family connection to him somehow. Like, not directly. It's not in my family, but he's like somebody I went. Anyway, whatever. So, but anyhow, Donald Rumsfeld, right? So he's a neocon. And the pivotal moment in his career was, you would think that, Democrats were defeated. Democrats were defeated, and Donald Rumsfeld came into office. You'd be wrong, right? Richard Nixon's ouster, when Richard Nixon was forced out of office, that's when Donald Rumsfeld moved in. It was a very big moment for Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld came in after Nixon's ouster, right? That was a big moment in his career. And the ouster of Richard Nixon was really a big moment in American politics. People don't realize that that was a big moment. And again, we're not on the right, we're on the left. So we often try to lump all right-wingers together. And if you do that, if you lump all right-wingers together, you kind of miss the point, because there are different factions in the ruling class. There are different alliances and tendencies. And Richard Nixon was very much a right-wing demagogue. He was in with the military-industrial complex. He was in with the FBI. But he was very much, a Bonapartist right-winger, an extremist. And in order to do that, he had kind of a right-wing demagogic populism about him. And Richard Nixon was suspicious of neoliberalism, right? And this is, again, shocking, right? Nowadays, neoliberalism, neoliberal economics is basically the religion of the United States. Democrats believe in it, except for like Bernie Sanders. Mainstream Democrats believe in neoliberalism. All Republicans pretty much believe in neoliberalism. But Richard Nixon was a Republican, a right-wing anti-communist, a racist. I mean, you should listen to those awful recordings of him talking. And, he sent the FBI to crush the Black Panthers. And he bombed and massacred millions in Vietnam. But he was a right-wing populist to the point that he was critical of neoliberalism. Basically Nixon, in order to do what he did, he built a base of these right-wing guys they called hard hats. They were right-wing dudes who were like construction workers or worked in factories, have secularists replaced creator with systems. These hard hats, they were called. And they were right-wing conservative guys, but they were working class guys. Nixon was a big supporter of the Teamsters Union. The Teamsters Union was a right-wing union that were aligned with Republicans. And, Nixon was happy to unleash neoconservatism on Chile with the coup, but he wasn't willing to push forward neoliberalism. For example, many people don't know this, Richard Nixon advocated a guaranteed minimum income for all citizens of the United States. Did you know that? He actually called for a guaranteed minimum income. And he argued that instead of having welfare to low-income families, every family, regardless of income, every family with children should automatically get a payout from the government. And that way, low-income families wouldn't face humiliation. Richard Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency. Nixon created the Office of Occupational Safety and Health, OSHA. Richard Nixon lowered the voting age to 18. Richard Nixon, he ended the draft. Richard Nixon. I mean, there's many quote unquote progressive reforms that were considered to be Nixon. Milton Friedman, who is one of the most important neoliberal economists, was an advisor to Richard Nixon's campaign when he ran for president in 1968. And then, after Nixon took office, there was an economic downturn in 1971. And at that point, Richard Nixon expelled Milton Friedman from his campaign. And he expelled him, he kicked him out. And he said, we're all Keynesians now, meaning we all believe that there should be government intervention in the economy. And he kicked Milton Friedman, the neoliberal economist, out of the White House. He implemented the Nixon shocks, they were called, dramatic Bonapartist economic moves, a wage and price freeze. He froze wages and froze prices, right? Prices couldn't go up and no one got a raise, right? He took the USA off the gold standard. These were all some pretty dramatic economic moves. And the wage freeze was awful. Working people were very angry about that. It was a very anti-working class move. But it was something that he did in the hopes of trying to stabilize the economy. And no, Nixon was not based. He was a Bonapartist, and I'm explaining divisions. Nixon was an awful president, but I'm trying to explain to you the fight in the ruling class. So, Nixon was in there, and he was trying to stabilize. I heard Nader had a lot to do with creating the EPA. All right, Nader, EPA. And Nixon was trying to stabilize. You think that's why they got rid of him? That's why. Well, I'll address that here, Christopher. So he did that. He took the dramatic move of going to China and meeting with Mao, which no Republican or no Democrat would have ever been able to do. If a Democrat had done that, everyone would have called him a communist and a traitor. But Nixon, he did it, and he was able to do it, right? It was Henry Kissinger's idea. Henry Kissinger had the idea of manipulating China against the Soviet Union. It was really Henry Kissinger who engineered it. Henry Kissinger got the United States to withdraw recognition from Taiwan. And no Democrat would have been able to do that. So Nixon basically, the USA was in a crisis in 1968. They was losing the Vietnam War. It was, there was black liberation protests. I actually have uploaded segments on this before, but we can do it again. There were black liberation protests going on in the streets of the country. And so the U.S. ruling class said, okay, we need a strong man. We need somebody who's a little bit more like a dictator to come in. So Nixon got into office. He fired my old boss, Ramsey Clark, who I worked with at the International Action Center, who was Attorney General. Fired my old boss, Ramsey Clark. In fact, he said on the campaign trail, the first thing I will do is fire Ramsey Clark. And he did. He fired Ramsey Clark. And Ramsey Clark got fired. He fired Ramsey Clark, the U.S. Attorney General, who was very liberal. And after that, he went in there, and Ramsey Clark, the U.S. Attorney General, had been trying to stop and hold back the FBI. The FBI had been going after the Black freedom struggle and such, and Ramsey Clark, had been trying to hold back the FBI. Ramsey Clark was fired, and then Nixon went to the FBI and he said, go get him. And he sent the FBI after the Black Panther Party. Viciously, and viciously they went after the Black Panther Party. There's the killing of Fred Hampton, and COINTELPRO escalated like crazy, with Ramsey Clark out of there. Also, the USA went all in on Vietnam. Throughout his campaign in 1968, Richard Nixon had been telling everybody he'd been telling everybody that he had a secret plan to win in Vietnam. And when he got into office, everyone found out what that secret plan was. It was Operation Rolling Thunder. It was mass bombing of North Vietnam. It was just bombing the hell out of North Vietnam and killing millions of Vietnamese people. Just massive bombing. But it didn't work. It didn't work. And after a couple of years, it didn't work. He escalated the Vietnam as much as one possibly could. It didn't work. The Vietnamese people were still fighting for their freedom. And so he pulled out of Vietnam. He went all in Vietnam, which the liberals wouldn't do. And when that didn't work, he pulled out, right? Which the liberals also weren't willing to do. The liberals, Lyndon Johnson, was like, going in, but trying not to go in, and kept going in more and kept going in more, and finally refused, just basically refused to run for president again. Well, Nixon said, I'm going to go in. I have a secret plan for Vietnam. And his secret plan was to go all in and just murder millions of people. And then when that didn't work, he pulled out. Nixon did a lot of things that were dramatic moves because he was acting like a dictator. He was acting like a strong man. And in order to carry it out, he had a base of these right wing guys that were called hard hats. And they actually had the hard hat riots in New York City, where they got a whole bunch of construction worker guys to go beat up anti-war protesters. And they wore these, their hard hats, and they went and beating up anti-war protesters. There was a TV show at the time called All in the Family. And the show was about a conservative right wing Nixon supporter named Archie Bunker, who was a racist, and that's Nixon's supporters tended to be, middle class right wing racist white guys. That tended to be who the typical Nixon supporter was. It was a hard hat. It was a racist white middle class guy. The Teamsters Union. Right, the Teamsters Union is a great example of that. He was a big supporter. He actually let Jimmy Hoffa, the leader of the Teamsters Union, out of prison. Jimmy Hoffa was in prison, and he let him out. He let Jimmy Hoffa out of jail. And so Richard Nixon was like a right-wing Bonapartist. And the ruling class didn't like that. And they wanted to implement neoliberalism, and he wouldn't do it, right? He was there to stabilize the United States. 1972, you have this big economic downturn, and he took the Nixon shocks, and he was calling for a guaranteed minimum income. He creates OSHA, he creates the EPA, he starts affirmative action. Did you know that? Nixon had some of the first federal affirmative action policies. So Nixon takes all these dramatic moves, and the crisis is over. He crushes the Black Panther Party. He pulls out of Vietnam, in effect ending the anti-war movement. And basically, by the time Nixon leaves office, military support as a communist. By the time Nixon leaves office, the USA is no longer in a crisis. He ended the crisis. He did what he was supposed to do. They picked Nixon to be the strong man, the dictator, to end the crisis. And he did. And then they hated him for it. The U.S. ruling class doesn't want to have a dictator. The U.S. ruling class is terrified of strong men. They don't like Roosevelt. They didn't like Lincoln. And they were terrified of having a strong man who could tell them what to do. And so they went out, the very same ruling class that picked Nixon to be their dictator, their strong man, got rid of Nixon when the crisis was over. Right? And Nixon, you almost feel sorry for him. Right? Imagine that somebody gave you a job. Somebody hired you and they said, your job is to file the papers. So you went and you filed the papers. And they said, how dare you file the papers? Get out of here. You're fired. That's kind of what the U.S. ruling class did to Nixon. They hired him to be the dictator, to end the political crisis, and to end the economic crisis. And he did it. And then they got mad at him for it. And they exposed him, the Watergate scandal and the tapes and everything else. And he left office. He's the only U.S. president to have ever resigned in all of U.S. history. Remembered as, I am not a crook. I am not a crook. But everyone remembers him as a crook. He's gone down. And it's like he did what they told him to do. And because he did it, and they were afraid that he had too much power, he gained too much power while he did it, and then they got him out of there. And they made him the fall guy, as JT24 is pointing out, for COINTELPRO, for the Vietnam. They blamed him for a lot of the stuff the entire ruling class had done. So Richard Nixon, when they ousted Richard Nixon wasn't going to play ball with neoliberalism. So they replaced Richard Nixon with all of these people that were neoliberals. Gerald Ford came in, and Gerald Ford, he brought Alan Greenspan into his administration. And Ayn Rand, right? The fountainhead, right? The satanic right-wing extremist libertarian Ayn Rand went to the White House with Alan Greenspan, her little protege, and he took his oath and he was sworn in. There's a picture of Gerald Ford and Alan Greenspan and Ayn Rand getting sworn in. And Gerald Ford brought in Dick Cheney, and he brought in Donald Rumsfeld. And Donald Rumsfeld, the pivotal moment in his career, was the ouster of Richard Nixon. When Nixon was out, Nixon, the right-wing Bonapartist, the right-wing populist, was out, and neocons, neoconservatism, and neoliberal economics was in, that's where Donald Rumsfeld came from, right? And, the Bush administration was full of people who started in 1974, who started when Nixon was ousted. The ouster of Nixon was a huge victory for neoliberalism. And this is what people don't seem to get, right? Nixon had fought with neoliberal economists, and the beginning of the ouster of Richard Nixon was the beginning. It was the very beginning of the triumph of neoliberal economics in the United States. That Nixon had been a resistor of that. So Donald Rumsfeld. What else do I remember about Donald Rumsfeld? If I keep answering questions like this, we're going to be on here all night. That's okay. Another thing about a Donald Rumsfeld that I remember is I remember that Donald Rumsfeld at one point he was confronted by protesters at the State Department or wherever he was speaking, the defense. And I remember, they said, "You lied about weapons of mass destruction." And he said, "I didn't lie." He said, "I didn't lie. In fact, everyone thought they had weapons of mass destruction. In fact, they were all wearing chemical suits when they went to Iraq." And the protesters shot back at Donald Rumsfeld and said, "Of course they were wearing chemical suits because you told them that there were weapons of mass destruction. That's a non sequitur." And he just kind of shut up. He didn't have a response after that. It was like, whoops. Wah, wah, wah. He thought he had like the best comeback ever, right? It's like, man, everybody thought they had weapons of mass destruction. I mean, look, they were wearing chemical suits. So clearly we didn't lie about it. It's like, of course they were wearing chemical suits. You told them to. And you lied to them. Wah, wah, wah. And he was just kind of speechless after that. That was kind of a classic moment. It was Ray McGovern who confronted him. Yes, Ray McGovern, the ex-CIA whistleblower who I've interviewed before. Ray McGovern confronted him. That was a beautiful moment. It was like one of the most beautiful moments ever to see, Donald Rumsfeld, because Republicans embrace neoliberalism, is it legit to call both parties liberals? I'm writing it down. Both parties liberals. So that's what I've said about Rumsfeld. All right, cool. At what point does a communist become a revisionist? Well, the thing is, the term revisionism, that's Edward Bernstein. Edward Bernstein, a very important thinker in European social democracy, he called himself a revisionist. He invented his own ideology called revisionist Marxism. He said, the movement is everything, the goal is nothing. The movement is everything, the goal is nothing. And revisionism was originally, it was a belief in evolutionary socialism. Evolutionary socialism. It was not a slur, right? Revisionism became a slur in the 50s or in the 60s when China started accusing the Soviet Union of being revisionists. But originally it was not a slur. And I don't like the term revisionist. I'll just be honest. I don't like it because, again, there is a real school of thought called revisionist Marxism. It's social democracy. It's the idea that capitalism just kind of naturally turns into socialism. The movement is everything. The goal is nothing. The movement is everything. The goal is nothing. That's revisionism. And, the people who came up with the term revisionist Marxism, they very much thought it was a great term. So when communists were fighting with each other during the late Cold War, we all started calling each other revisionists. You're a revisionist. No, you're a revisionist. Yeah, well, you're a revisionist. Yeah, well, your mom is a revisionist. Yeah, well, your sister's a revisionist. I mean, I don't know, okay? I'm not interested in arguing about who is a revisionist. I'm interested in arguing about, are your policies correct? Are they correct? I love your impressions and your level-headed, articulate manner of fact style, reassuring chaos. Well, thank you. Thank you, Red Rye. I do my best. I do my best. So, I don't really like the term, honestly. There is reformism. There is pro-democratic party elements. There are people that preach socialism, but they practice fascism to preserve capitalism for the bosses. Such a thing exists, okay? But revisionist is not the best word, because if revisionist is a slur, the implication is that you can never revise anything that Karl Marx ever said. right? Because if you revise it, then that's bad. Well, Lenin revised Marx, right? Marx didn't believe in nationalism. Lenin had this whole theory of imperialism. So did Lenin revise Marx? Yes, but he revised him correctly. No one calls Lenin a revisionist because his revisions were correct. His revisions were correct. So there you go. So it's like, the issue isn't whether or not you revise. The issue is, do you revise correctly or not? So I don't like the term. All right. Contemporary music, classical music, and contemporary classical music. All right. Well, the reason that I argue that classical music is better than contemporary music, it's better for you emotionally. I listen to contemporary music, a lot of classic rock and all that. Have you ever been to continental Europe? I don't think so. I haven't. I don't think I have. I don't think I've been to continental Europe. I've been to Britain when I was a kid. I went to Britain, but I don't think I've been to continental Europe. But anyway, is that, Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, Haydn, Handel, those folks, they're not trying to appeal to you on an emotional level. They're trying to appeal to you on an intellectual level. You're paying attention to the patterns of the notes. And that is better for you, right? It's like, some of this stuff, Bach, Beethoven, you could actually write mathematical formulas to figure out what notes they're going to play next, right? I mean, it's like you're following the patterns of the notes in your mind. And it's mathematical, it's almost geometrical, okay? Whereas contemporary music is trying to hit you with emotion as hard as you can, right? It's like hit you with this emotion, pump you up. And that I argue that classical music stimulates the more rational side of your mind, whereas emotional music stimulates the more emotional side of your mind, okay? Now, contemporary classical music, it's a little bit of a combination of both, right? Like Wagner is trying to hit you emotionally. All right, well, I'm going to address that later when I talk about capitalists in the party and stuff. So I'll talk about that later, ThinkPad. That's already in the super chats. But they're hitting you emotionally. Wagner is hitting you emotionally, right? Wagner is hitting you emotionally. A lot of post-Wagner music, classical music, it's quote unquote classical, but it's still hitting you. It's like rock and roll, right? And I like Wagner in some ways. The Siegfried Funeral March is an amazing piece of music, but it's all emotional. He's hitting you emotionally, right? It's not a Beethoven symphony. It's a different kind of thing. It's a totally different experience. But like a lot of contemporary classical music, like a lot of musical scores I enjoy listening to. And they're done with an orchestra. They're like musical scores for movies and such. So you could argue that that's contemporary classical music I like. Next question. All right. My predictions about Vosh and Cuba came true. Folks, BreadTube serves imperialism. BreadTube serves imperialism. BreadTube serves imperialism. I mean, it's like funny. Like, did they want to prove me right? I mean, was that what these people wanted to do? I mean, I write a book called BreadTube Serves Imperialism, and then Vosh announces he supports the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan, and then they're all lining up to support the color revolution in Cuba to destabilize Cuba. I mean, it's like, okay, well, I mean, if they want to prove me right, I mean, they say if you give a man enough rope, he might hang himself. And then they just tell people my book is a big, long Twitter thread or something. So whatever. All right. Next question. U.S. sanctions, their history. Well, the most vicious sanctions the USA has ever imposed have obviously been on Cuba and the blockade. But look, I mean, U.S. sanctions have been pretty crazy. It used to be in every U.S. passport. In every U.S. passport, it actually had a special notation. When you got your U.S. passport, it said, not valid in, and listed all the communist countries. Did you know that? It actually said in your U.S. passport, not valid in China, Red China. It would say not valid in Red China, North Vietnam. I mean, it would North Korea. I mean, it was like they had a list, right? And that your U.S. passport. I mean, they don't say that anymore, right? The USA doesn't have diplomatic relations with North Korea, but it doesn't say that your U.S. passport works in North Korea. it's pretty wild. It's pretty wild. But yeah, I mean, the USA has tried to economically barricade and blockade many different countries. And, I mean, a lot of these sanctions have been declared by the president as states of emergency, right? And I remember this came to light, during the Trump administration. People widely knew this, but there's like states of emergency declared for Zimbabwe and Belarus. And like, in order to impose sanctions on a country, the president declares a state of emergency, and then he can impose sanctions on a country without like congressional approval. It's like, it's nuts. It's just completely nuts. All right, next question. Mandel and Bettelheim on Cuba. Okay, so I know Ernst Mandel was the Trotskyite economist in Europe in the 1960s and 70s. He was a Marxist economist who was widely studied in Europe during the 1960s and 70s. Ernst Mandel, and I've read some of his writing. There's even a documentary about his life I saw. Big Trotskyite, Fourth International. And honestly, his economic texts, like his introductory economics books, are pretty decent, honestly. His books about like what is capitalism, introduction to economics, that kind of stuff is pretty decent. You can learn a lot from that. Charles Bettelheim. Charles Bettelheim was a Maoist economist who was very, very enthusiastic in support of the Cultural Revolution. He really liked the Cultural Revolution in China because he felt it was democratic. He felt it showed democracy in practice. I've read Charles Bettelheim and I've read Ernst Mandel. Charles Bettelheim hung out with Monthly Review. He was like a Maoist. Ernst Mandel was a Trotskyite. I have no idea what their debate about Cuba was. So I don't know anything about that. That's before my time. I've read Charles Bettelheim's stuff on the Cultural Revolution, and I've read Ernst Mandel's stuff on economics, and, he was a Trotskyite dude, but I don't know what their disagreement about Cuba was, so I can't address that. Next super chat question. How old am I? I am 33 years old. Next question. Hong Kong protests, classist bigotry. Many people pointed out that the Hong Kong protests were the wealthier, it was the rich kids of Hong Kong, and that it was working class people who tended to oppose them, and that there was also an element of like Western chauvinism. The Hong Kong protesters would claim, well, we're more European, we're more Western, right? And that we're not like the rest of China, we're more civilized, we're more Western. We used to be a British protectorate, so there you go. Next question. Cuba, Solidarność in Poland. Yeah, I mean, look, the color revolution industry has been going for a long time. The Solidarność stuff in Poland, that certainly happened. That's a reality. And we'll see what happens in Cuba, right? The next question. Did I use Vosch's autism against him? No, I did not. I pointed out that there are certain, I'm trying to analyze who Vosch is, right? And that I talk about various aspects of Vosch's background. And I actually didn't know that Vosch was bragging about his, or I shouldn't say bragging, but was open about his autism. Didn't know that at the time. But many people that I have spoken to and many observers have said that his behavior, where he doesn't seem to be able to understand other people's arguments, and he's extremely rude and insensitive. Many people have said, well, actually, that's probably related to neurology. It's not simply him being a jerk, but it's related to some neurological condition or something. That's the only point I was making. So, again, like everything in the book, you can take it out of context. You can say that me mentioning Chelsea Manning in the section on H. Brewis proves I hate Chelsea Manning. That's not what it says. There's so many people lying and misrepresenting it. This book is not about Vosch. Book is not about Vosch. Vosch is mentioned in it. This book is about ideas. There is one chapter at the beginning called Who and What is BreadTube, where I talk about ContraPoints and Vosch and H-Bomber Guy and Socialism Done Left and a few other people. The rest of the book focuses on their ideas, okay? This is not a big, long Twitter thread. And the fact that these people lie about this, it's getting great reviews. Max Blumenthal has read it and loves it. It's tweeted about it. It's read the reviews from people who actually bought it. This book is a hit. This book is a hit. People love this. So there you go. Next question. Ceausescu. Ceausescu was the leader of socialist Romania. During the 1980s, he signed a lot of deals with like Bank of America, and he created economic distance between himself and the Soviet Union, and that had some catastrophic economic consequences. There were a lot of big economic problems in Romania in the 1980s. The achievements of socialism in Romania in terms of healthcare, hospitals, literacy, the country study, the U.S. country study. Again, go back and look at the U.S. Library of Congress country study. A lot of things were achieved, but in the 80s, there were some big economic problems created by, their relationship with American banks. And ultimately, that culminated in the overthrow of socialism, right? So there you go, right? That contributed. All right. A very important super chat I received. What about progressive elements in the capitalist class? And are there capitalists in parties in the workers' state? How does that work? Well, in Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, Friedrich Engels talks about the working class seizing the means of production as representative of all society. And there's an understanding that it's not just the workers, not just factory workers that benefit from socialism, peasants benefit from it, and that all of society, ultimately, in the long term, benefits from socialism, right? Now, obviously, the capitalists don't benefit from it at the beginning because they lose their position as the ruling class. They lose their position as the ruling class, number one, and on top of that, they often will have their property seized or nationalized. But is it possible that there could be capitalists who could be beneficial to the construction of socialism? Yes. The difference between capitalism and socialism is not whether or not a private sector exists. The difference is, why is production carried out? That's the difference. Under capitalism, production is carried out to make profits. Under socialism, production is carried out for social good, for social use. And there are private companies in Vietnam, there are private companies in China, there are private companies in Nicaragua, and they operate to make profits for themselves, but they are controlled and forced to work in the context of an economy that's overall centrally planned. So that is a difference. That's a very, very big difference. That's a very, very big difference. A very, very big difference. Right? And, I think that there are a lot of capitalists in the United States that would benefit from the enactment of socialism. Now, the richest capitalists wouldn't, right? Obviously, the huge monopolies, the big oil companies, the giants, General Electric, BP, Chevron, Shell, the big healthcare, big pharma corporations, the huge monopolies wouldn't benefit. But I think small business owners would definitely benefit from socialism. When you have a rationally planned economy and everyone's living standards go up, people are going to be able to spend more money at your local store and at your local restaurant and your local hotel. When the means of production are rationally organized and, production is carried out to serve public good and not the profits of a few, they're going to have better roads on which people can drive to small businesses. And that there are a lot of capitalists who believe in economic growth, who want to see economic prosperity and would benefit and see their profits increase by having the means of production overall and the major centers of economic power controlled by the people, right? By having banking in the hands of the state and strategically planned out, by having health care provided for all, by having, major industries like steel manufacturing, power, electricity, agriculture, and, food, the agribusiness be nationalized. You could see a lot of folks really benefit, really economically benefit. A lot of small business owners would really benefit from socialism. And I think there's a room for small business owners. And I think that there are a lot of lower level capitalists in the United States who want better infrastructure, want, banking to be rationally, strategically planned out so there's growth, would want healthcare to be provided for the population, would want natural resources to go into the public budget so the country's not bankrupt. I think there are a lot of capitalists in the United States who, while, their ability to maybe become, the 1% and become the ultra rich would be taken away, they would ultimately see their profits increase with a socialist economy, right? And I think that's very possible. And again, this all sounds like, if you don't understand what socialism actually is, if you think socialism is a worker co-op, if you think socialism is an employee stock ownership program, you're going to have no idea what I'm talking about here. But socialism is when the economy is rationally organized to serve public good. It's when the banks, factories, and industries are organized to serve public good and not profits. When will imperialism end? All right. All right. Okay. Okay. Replaced. Okay. Ralph Nader's involvement in passing the EPA. Yes, I know Ralph Nader was involved in a lot of consumer protection, laws and agitation. He was a very important figure in the early 1970s, a very important cultural icon. He was never a socialist. I mean, he was a progressive. He was certainly left wing or liberal. He was never a socialist. Ralph Nader is Ralph Nader, and his main thing was kind of consumer advocacy and such. He's an important figure in U.S. society. And his presidential campaigns, in 2000 and such, I mean, he was kind of countering neoliberalism. But there you go. All right. How do you gain military support as a communist? Well, I think there's many people in the military, financial class. There's many people in the U.S. military, who are opposed to these wars, right? And they wonder why, they joined the military because they wanted to protect Americans from Al Qaeda. And then they go to Syria and they find out we're supporting Al Qaeda. Okay. Okay. Right wing framing. Right wing border narratives. All right. And, there's a lot of people in the military who, they go in, they want to, they need to pay for college. They see it as a job, and they go in there and they say, what are we fighting for? There's a long history of that. Tulsi Gabbard represents much more than herself. I mean, I think there's a lot of people in the Pentagon who are asking questions about why these wars are happening. Look, Ron Paul was an awful libertarian. I didn't support Ron Paul, but the fact that Ron Paul got a huge amount of military support showed that within the ranks of the military, there are many that are questioning the endless wars. So I think there is anti-imperialist sentiment within the military. But at the end of the day, winning support from people in the military is with the same way you would win support among the broader population overall. You have to make the case that your policies would improve life in the country. That's what you need to do, right? It's not about fomenting civil war. It's not about hating average Americans. It's not about, trying to make life worse. We need to put forward policy solutions that would improve the lives of Americans. We need to develop a program, and that's what the Center for Political Innovation has done. With the 4-point economic program, which is on our website, cpiusa.org, or furthermore, with the the Sandino-Zapata Economic Corridor for immigration, with Fusion City. You need policy solutions. All right. Both parties are liberals. Well, in the United States, right, economic liberalism, right? So many people have pointed out that it's a matter of emphasis. Liberalism is the ruling ideology in the United States, Patty. But there is economic liberalism, which is the focus of conservatives, and there is social liberalism, which is the focus of liberals. Liberalism is an ideology that says the individual comes before all else. Economic liberalism is the part that's emphasized by conservatives. Social liberalism is what is emphasized by liberals. But at the end of the day, liberalism is the ruling ideology. So yes, both parties in the United States are liberals. You are correct. All right. When will imperialism end? When will imperialism end? Imperialism will end when the huge corporations that dominate the U.S. economy, the big multinational corporations, are dismantled, right? And when the USA begins to trade with countries on the basis of win-win cooperation, and this global monopolistic capitalist system where a few corporations and banks based in the West enrich themselves by making the rest of the world poor, when that system is dismantled, that's when imperialism will end. Imperialism is not a policy. Imperialism is not an action. Imperialism is a system. Lenin wrote an entire book called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, describing an economic system. And imperialism is a global economic order. And when that global economic order is dismantled, that will be the end of imperialism. All right, what will happen to the financial class? Well, I would think that their role would be very much reduced. I know in China they do have a stock market, but that stock market, in the United States, like half the population is somehow tied into the stock market. In China, it's a very small percentage. When the Chinese stock market crashed back in 2015, the Chinese economy just kept moving because most of the economy is insulated from market turbulence, right? And that there would probably be some financial sector in a socialist society to some degree or other, but it would not be the dominant section, right? And the financialization of capital in the United States in our time is very disturbing, very, very disturbing, I think. I mean, the fact that, everything is tied into the stock market. And if the stock market, if our stock market in the United States were to do what China's stock market did in 2015, there would be riots in the streets. Like the electricity would go off. Food would not be delivered. It would be utter chaos. But, in China, their stock market took a nosedive, and then the next week it was back to normal and nobody noticed because the Chinese economy is not centered around the financial sector, it's centered around the state. All right, right-wing narratives on the border. These right-wing folks, they're playing up this idea the immigrants are coming. Oh my God, they're going to take all our jobs. They took our jobs. But look, there's an element to some of this, okay? Look, at the end of the day, if you increase the repression of immigrant communities, you're going to strengthen the gangs. MS-13 is going to get stronger. If people have to get smuggled across the border, if it's harder and harder to cross the border, they're going to get paid more money to smuggle people across. If immigrant communities are afraid to call the police because they don't want to get deported, then MS-13 and groups like that are going to flourish in immigrant neighborhoods. If immigrant communities are terrified and in the shadows because there's ICE raids going on, kicking down doors, tearing apart families, that is the atmosphere in which these criminal elements that right-wingers are so afraid of get stronger. If you hate MS-13, you should hate Donald Trump's immigration policies because they're the best thing for MS-13. You know what would destroy MS-13? What would just really devastate them? Legalization. If they gave a blanket amnesty to all the immigrants in the United States, made them all full U.S. citizens, then MS-13 would go, oh shit, where are we going to recruit from? Oh shit, now all these people can get like regular normal jobs and we can't recruit them to our drug dealing terrorist, killing gang, but the real solution to the crisis at the border, I've said many times, the real solution to the crisis at the border is the Sandino-Zapata economic corridor. It is a matter of national security that we have economic development of Honduras and Guatemala, that there be an alliance between Nicaragua, Mexico, the United States, and China to bring economic development, schools, hospitals, electricity, running water, to the regions where people are desperately fleeing from. It needs to happen. That's the only way you can deal with this. We need economic development of that region as a matter of national security. And on that note, folks, I am at the end of my rope. I am exhausted. It's been a long stream, but that's good. It's been a good night, so I bid you adieu. I'll end the way I always end my streams. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, but the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggressions. The danger of a new world war still exists. The people of all countries must get prepared. Revolution is the main trend in the world today. I think the idea of Iran getting along with its neighbors is a good thing. So there you go, Frank. I mean, I think peace and stability in Afghanistan and in that region is a good thing. I'm not a fan of the Taliban, but there you go. The danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared. But revolution is the main trend in the world today, and we need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. Fusion City now. Fusion City now. Fusion City now.